We're going to talk about Asia today, East Asia, China. We probably won't get to Japan today. It'll probably be next time. So as we move along, let's see how we do. There we go. I wanted to start by sort of picking up our history of China and give a little bit of a survey of it and see what happens there and how it's affected, especially by the Europeans, colonialism, imperialism of the Europeans. The Manchu dynasty, you can see this map. I used to put maps on the test, and what I would do is I'd put a blank map on the test. This is what I used to do. And on it, I would have a list of letters. So it would just be like A through G. Then I would have names numbered like 1 through 12, and you'd have to match the letter with the location. Maybe I should bring that back, because people really don't know their maps. But I knew there was troubles, because I would put a map up there, and it would basically be an outline of a map, and it would have those letters on it. And then people would ask me. This one guy called me over, and I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Where's the water?" So I knew we were kind of in trouble then. So where's the water? The water is out here. So I always think of it. This is water. This is water. This is all land. And then he would say, "Okay, thanks." And So anyway, maps. Why do I use maps? Because you need to know what's happening. Maps, geography, really makes you understand the history. That's why I'm sad I don't have the maps on there anymore. Well, the Manchu dynasty, or the Qin dynasty, lasts, as you can see there, for over 200 years, almost, not quite 300 years, from 1644 to 1911. Pretty specific dates, right? They're at their height of power at about 1800. Okay, 1800. And after that, we can begin, as we look back on it, to see that they're declining. This is one of the things about history and these periods and so forth. It's hard to recognize sort of where you are if you were living then, right? I don't think a guy in 1810 would say, "Gee, we've declined since 1800." Or a guy in 1820, we've really declined since 1800. But looking back on it, we get a little perspective. And we can see that things have declined, things have changed. This is why I tell people, that teach that other kind of history that I won't mention, that's about America, that, you don't have enough perspective, really. I mean, we've only been around a couple hundred years, and who's to say what's going to happen? I sometimes say it's more like journalism than it is history. They don't like that usually when I say. That's why I try not to ever say that. So I didn't say it. I just said I used to say that kind of thing. Of course, I wouldn't say that now. Well, anyway, what led to this decline? Well, you point a lot of fingers. By the way, you know that when you point your finger at someone, you got 3 fingers pointed at you. I'll just keep that in mind. Maybe sometimes it's our fault. We don't like to think that. But sometimes it's true, whether we like it or not. Well, they got internal corruption. I think we can agree on that. We'll see that a bit. We're not going to look at it in detail, but they got problems internally. But certainly the thing that gets highlighted a lot is outside influence from the West, primarily the Europeans, who show up there, and they show up there first about 1600. And then, of course, especially then later, the British show up about 1800. Again, these are kind of round dates just to give us a ballpark. And the British are there, but they are at first restricted to the southern coastal part of China, that's called Canton. Canton. So, if you go into some, depends on where you're at, you can go to, say, a Chinese restaurant that specializes in Cantonese food or Mandarin food or things like this. Or what most of them just offer a variety of dishes in all, and they'll say next to it, maybe this is Cantonese style. This is. By the way, Cantonese style is much milder. It's not as spicy as the Mandarin. The Mandarin stuff is usually hotter and spicier. Just a little clue for you. If you go out to dinner tonight and you want to get yourself some Chinese food, you want something spicy, avoid the Cantonese. It's much more mild. That's, I give you all kinds of advice in here. I give you all sorts of things. Most of it you'll find not at all useful. Well, the British, they're very interested in China. Why would they be interested in China? Well, the British, I don't know if you know any British, kind of like that guy that I knew who was teaching, who had the British accent. He really wasn't British, but he had to sort of make believe that he was English or British. So to do that, of course, you got to drink a lot of tea. British love their tea. They have tea time. I went last summer. I'm planning to go this summer to go and excavate in England near Hadrian's Wall. It's up in the north. And, most of the digs I go to, you start very early in the morning. Like you get up at 4 and you're out there digging by 5 and so on. So, but these British are very civilized. It's very civilized. Of course, they got different weather too. We don't start digging till 9. And then, of course, you have lunch. And then, of course, you have tea time. We have tea time every day. It's about 2:30, I think. 2:30, 3 o'clock, we have tea time. That's kind of nice. We're coming up on tea time here. Maybe at the end of this class, you should go have yourself some tea, maybe a crumpet or a scone, something like that. Scones and tea. Scones are pretty good. Or a biscuit. British biscuits are not like our biscuits, You wouldn't want gravy with British biscuits. They're really what I would call a cookie. I don't think they use that word. Well, the British love their tea. Now, here's the problem. The Chinese had stuff the British wanted, but the British didn't have anything the Chinese wanted. It's maybe a little reminiscent of Valentine's Day for you. Maybe you got nothing that person is interested in, but you're very interested in them. So I'm just trying to make it personal, or maybe not too personal, but we'll call it the Valentine's Day situation here. That China doesn't, not interested at all in Britain. China says, look, can't we just be friends? And the British really want a serious commitment from China because they liked everything they had. They had porcelain, the dishes, right? That we just call China now. We call it China, right? China, glazed porcelain dishes and cups and everything, teacups and everything. So, yeah. And the British will finally imitate that. They've kind of figured out how to do it. And now, if you buy porcelains, China, for your house or something, a lot of it's going to come from England because that's where a lot of it's made today. But the Chinese had that process, and the British love that stuff. They love the tea. They love the silk, right? So the British tried to find something that the Chinese would want. They said, well, we got some nice cotton. Could we trade you cotton? We're growing cotton in India. It's great cotton. Let's trade that for the tea. Because you see, there was a trade deficit between the British and China, had a trade deficit. That's sort of like what we have today with China. We buy all kinds of stuff from China. Right? You go to the store, you're hard pressed to find stuff that's not made in China. I mean, there are some things that aren't, but I mean, we're buying all kinds of stuff from China. And what is China buying from us? Not too much. Well, we don't really need your American stuff, but you can buy our Chinese stuff. And then, see, when that happens, then our money goes to them, and then their money doesn't come to us. So we actually are giving them more money than they're giving us. That's a trade deficit, and that's where we have been with China for several years, actually, the United States. But the British were in this situation, let's say back around in the 19th century. So you're desperate to try. The Chinese said, we don't need your cotton. We grow our own cotton. Plus, we got silk, and we don't need any. You know what we really want from you, you British guys? Your silver. We want your hard currency. Give us your silver. Give us your gold. That's what we want. So the East India Company, which is a British company, right? You probably know that. I hope you know that by now. And they are trying to find a way to negotiate it, but those negotiations had failed. The guy who's leading these negotiations is a guy named Lord Macartney in 1793. They tried again with Lord Amherst in 1816. But when things still hadn't been turned around, the British got creative. They said, you know what? We need to find a product that the Chinese are going to love. We need to find a product they can't get enough of. We need to find something they don't have that we can sell to them. And they looked around. They said, you know what? We got the perfect thing. It's called opium. Opium. The Chinese got that opium, man. They decided that was pretty good stuff. They wanted more of that opium and more of that opium and more of that. And once you have a little. That's what I always tell people. The first one's for free. After that, then you got to pay me. So they started giving them the opium. And then the Chinese said, we like that opium. Can we have some more, please? And yes, you may. But it's going to cost you now. Well, pretty soon, there was a trade deficit the other way. They got all their silver back, and they started getting more out of the Chinese. So this is what starts to hurt the Chinese economy. Maybe they should have made a deal for the cotton. That's all I'm saying. I don't know. Anyway, and in fact, the opium comes, you know what opium comes from, right? How do you get opium? You guys seem to know a lot about it. Yeah, poppy seeds. So that's why when you go to the restaurant, be sure to order poppy seed dressing before you go in for your drug test, and that'll help you out. Yeah, because in the poppy seeds is the opium, and what they do is they extract it out, right? And then people smoke it. They smoke the opium. Okay, smoking the opium. So they have a little pipe, and they put the opium in there, and they smoke it. I think we mentioned that before. That's where we get the pipe dream. That sort of thing. Well, here's a couple of guys imbibing in opium, in what are often called opium dens, D-E-N, den. It's grown in northeast India, the northeastern part of India. It can also be grown in Afghanistan. Anyway, they grow the poppies there, and then they have to extract it out of there. And so the British are starting to do this, and they actually set up in Canton, once they get this thing rolling, they start setting up factories right in Canton to produce the opium. They bring in the poppy seed stuff, the poppies, and they bring out the opium. Pretty soon that silver bullion and gold is all flowing the other way, and China is losing big money to Great Britain because of this. And it happens pretty quickly. So that by 1839, the Chinese leader Lin Zhu writes to Queen Victoria, you probably heard of her, right? Queen Victoria, Vicky. And begs her to limit the opium sale. Please only sell, this many tons of opium here. Please don't increase it. We can't handle it financially. We also can't handle it because, when a guy is smoking opium, guess what? He doesn't want to do much else. All he's worried about is, where am I going to get more opium? This opium's now gone. I now need more opium. And that's all they really worry about. That's not very good for the economy. It doesn't make for a very productive workforce. But China tried to curtail it on their end by putting penalties to those people that are using opium, by arresting some opium dealers, by trying to seize supplies. And then they decide they're going to put a blockade on the British factories because they had set up factories in Canton. And so this will ultimately lead to a war, a literal war over opium. And, historians are very creative. So what do we call it? We call it the Opium Wars. Okay? Maybe you can think up a better name, but let's just stick with Opium Wars for now. So this is a war between China and Great Britain, and it's concerning opium, production and distribution of opium to China. So this will last from 1839 to 1842. But of course, the problem for the Chinese is that they are no match for the British military. Even though it was the Chinese who invented gunpowder, the Europeans had really perfected gunpowder as a weapon in small artillery and firearms of various kinds. And of course, the British Navy is at this point unstoppable, pretty much. Altogether. So, make a long story short, the British win. How's that? This is all settled with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. So not only is opium sales and stuff not limited, British access to Chinese ports is actually increased. They now will have 5 ports that the British control in China. Any British citizens basically are also not subject to Chinese laws or rules. They're subject to British law and rule. That's kind of nice. Sort of keeps the Chinese from prosecuting British citizens. And of course, here's the last, it's kind of, they said, you know what else? Since you guys started this war and you lost, you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay us what it cost us to defeat you in this war. Just by the way, you may have heard of a city called Hong Kong. You ever heard of Hong Kong? Hong Kong will become a British city, a protectorate, I guess you'd say, in 1842. And it was to remain such for 150 years, and it does, until 1992. So during that time, Hong Kong just exploded with business activity. It was the center of all kinds of commerce and banking and so forth. And then in 1992, of course, and citizens of Hong Kong had a British passport. And so as the year approached, people of Hong Kong got very nervous because they did not want to become a part of communist China. And so a bunch of them were just going to leave Hong Kong and move to England That's when England said, you know, if you have a Hong Kong passport, it is a British passport, but it's not really good for immigration to out of Hong Kong. You can't leave, basically. You're not coming here. That's what they said in a more polite way. Which, of course, didn't make people of Hong Kong very happy, and they didn't know what would happen. They thought maybe the communist Chinese would come in and rip everything down and destroy everything. But, of course, the Chinese, the communist Chinese, were kind of shrewd. They allowed Hong Kong to continue in their business ways, and it actually opened the door for Chinese to make a whole lot of money in the West because all that stuff had already been set up in Hong Kong. And so they allowed Hong Kong to sort of have some of their own rules that were separate from mainland China. Now they're beginning to restrict it more, and that's, maybe you've heard that in the past, 6 months, a year, there's been a lot of protests in Hong Kong. And it's still going on. It's not resolved. I'm not sure what the ultimate resolution would be. May well be a bunch of Chinese soldiers go in and take over Hong Kong. But we'll see. Like I said, I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but it is a place of problems and it's not going away. But this is where it got its start. Opium Wars. What built Hong Kong? Opium. Well, something like that. All right. Now, after the Opium Wars, most people say, by the time you get to that 1842, you're now entering the modern post-Opium War period of Chinese history. So most people say this is the beginning of modern Chinese history, 1842. Because not only did the British gain more ports, but China is so weakened that it cannot really maintain itself, and more Europeans actually come in and set themselves up along the coast of China to make money and to have trade. So other Western nations come in. They are competing somewhat with Britain, but these are places like the Germans. The Germans take over a whole peninsula there. The Dutch. Who else? I don't know. There's several others that come in, and they set up their own little areas there, especially along the coast. Of course, that's the most profitable. You got the harbors there, and you got the pretty good land there, and that's where you do the trade. And so there's still, you might find it to be interesting that still in China there are sections that are, have been influenced, say, by the Germans, or they've been influenced by the British, or they've been influenced by the Portuguese, for example, the Dutch. Well, all of this, of course, is going to create a lot of problems, a lot of internal economic problems for the Chinese. And as the Europeans continue to develop there, we see growing populations in China. We see corruption in the government. We see an increase in taxes. How are we going to pay for all this that we got to pay for? Well, got to charge the people. That's something to keep in mind, by the way. I hear a lot of people talking today about how all this stuff is going to be free. There's going to be all kinds of free stuff. Nothing's free. That's all I'll say. Nothing is free. Somebody's going to pay. And I'll tell you, if you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, you'll see who's going to be paying for it. It's going to be you and me that are paying for all this stuff because it's going to have to be paid for. And it's the same way here in China. They have to pay for it somehow. So what happens? You increase the taxes, which means people have less of their money. You have to give up more of their money. Well, eventually then, people get upset, and in the mid 19th century, there is a rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion, 1853 to 1864, rebels take over the city of Nanjing. This will bring about the end of the end of the rebellion will be brought in by the government of the Qing in 1864, but not without a lot of struggle and, of course, a lot of problems there. But also in the midst of this rebellion, the British and the French attack. Why? Well, they attacked because the trade had been disrupted. So remember, I told you as the Europeans expand across the world, the three M's. Remember the three M's? Merchants, missionaries, and military. And it often comes in that order. Almost always the merchants are first. They find a way to make money, they find a port, they find an avenue, they find goods, and they begin to do trade. Once it becomes clear that, there is a way to contact these people, there is sort of an open door, then missionaries tend to go next. As the missionaries are there and they begin to live in that area, begin to work with the people and so forth, then usually there's some kind of problem, some kind of tension, maybe some kind of violence, and that's when the military comes in. And we see that kind of pattern here. The British and the French attack. Why? Because the missionaries are being limited or harassed in some way. Also because trade is not flowing the way they think it should. And so they actually do capture Beijing in 1860. So most of the coastal areas of China, which by the way is the most profitable areas, the wealthiest areas, those are controlled by Europeans, and now the city of Beijing.
Who captures Beijing?
The British and the French, yeah. Well, they end up with the Treaty of Tianjin. This just brings in even more opium. It now makes it, all of it's legal. It's legal all over China now. More ports are open to trade. The Kowloon Peninsula goes to the British. Some areas in the north go to the Russians. There are some uprisings, but regional, what's happening now is the centralized government is so weak that they really can't deal with the problems. So you start to see developing regional armies, regional, what I might call militias or warlords, or whatever term you want to use. They're beginning to sort of keep law and order, or sort of run things in these different areas. Now, during this time of trouble, when these warlords or these regional armies get set up, they refuse then to disband. And then guess what they start to do? They start collecting taxes on their own for themselves. Excuse me. So basically what you got now is a regional government. Centralized government is in big trouble because they got the Europeans taking off a lot of their money, and now they got these regional armies that are collecting taxes in their region, and of course the money's not coming into the central office. So you see a real downward spiral in the 19th century, sort of beginning with the opium coming in and just increasing over the next 30, 40 years until China is really in big, big trouble. Now, some people in the government, and we might put this in the category maybe too little too late. They decide that they need to learn from the West. It's one thing just to reject the West, but it's obvious that the West is having a lot of success, right? So some people in China said we should learn from the West. Even though we're very proud, we're Chinese, we want to do it our way, but you know what? We can learn something from them. We'll learn from them in military and quote-unquote practical terms or matters. But still, our sort of spiritual or intellectual side will still belong to Confucius and Eastern way of thinking. So a little slogan came: East for essence, West for practical use. Probably sounds a little better in Chinese. So in other words, we're going to sort of try to maintain our Chineseness, if that's a word, our local approach in matters of sort of intellectual, religious, philosophical. But in practical matters, things to do with business, military, that sort of thing, we're going to try to imitate the West. One of the things they need to do to imitate the West is to modernize. Remember, we've talked about it in here, industrialization. Remember, we talked about industrialization. Industrialization begins in England and rapidly spreads across England, parts of Europe, the United States, but it hasn't really come to China. So they begin in 1875 to modernize things in China. What do we mean by that? Well, they're going to modernize their transportation, their weaponry, going to have railroads that will be Western in style, will help to transport goods, people, and even military across long treks of land on trains. Going to have to build new shipyards so that we can bring in, make sure we can get the ships in that have the cargo, military ships, be able to build and repair and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, weapons. But, this is probably too little too late. Well, I think everyone would agree that they're getting into this industrialization pretty late in the game, and it's not going to be enough to curtail all the problems they have had. So this means that even though they begin this in 1875, China is going to continue to decline. Okay. So notice now it's all happened pretty quickly, right? The first sort of hints of problems are around 1800, 75 years, 70 years. That's really, may seem like a long time, but it's not really that long of a time to go from being quite powerful to being extremely dependent and weak. So we see then increasingly China will now lose territory. Everyone is looking at China with greedy eyes to get what they can from it, right? In the north, up in the northern areas of China, the Russians really want this territory. Why? Well, one thing we don't worry about it too much here in Florida, right? Because you're going over here in February and swimming on President's Day, so that kind of tells you something about the area, right? But the Russians are always concerned about having a port that they can use in the winter, a year-round port. Because a lot of the ports, as a matter of fact, most of the ports in in Russia, freeze over so that they cannot be used in the dead of winter. But if they could get some of this northern territory up here, they could have a warm water port where they could sail in and out of it all year, for military, for trade. And so the Russians take this northeast area here to sort of connect their holdings with Siberia and get out to the sea. The British and the French are very interested in Southeast Asia. Britain down in the southern part of China, Canton and so forth, Hong Kong. But the French move into Indochina, as it's sometimes called. It'll later be called French Indochina. And of course, we will know that later on as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Okay? China will also have a war with Japan. That peninsula right there, right? You know that peninsula. That's the Korean peninsula. And the Chinese had pretty much control over that peninsula for quite a while. They had controlled it. But of course, the Japanese have been eyeing it as well. And the Japanese will eventually take control of it. And not only there, but the Chinese were going to come, or the Japanese are going to come to this peninsula out here. Well, we're going to show you that. Okay? So they begin to lose territory, losing to the Russians, losing to the Japanese, losing to the British, losing to the French. Coastal areas, areas to the north, areas to the south. Well, this leads to a war that's sometimes called the Sino-Japanese War. Sino is for China. So it lasts a couple of years. You can see this map, that dark little area, that peninsula sticking out. It's called Shandong. This peninsula, this area, is not far from, as you can see it there, it's not far from Korea. And over here's Japan. So it's up in their neighborhood. Because the other thing we haven't talked about here yet, and probably we'll talk about it on Thursday, is that the Japanese have also been forced to be opened by the West, but the Japanese are able to get themselves industrialized sooner and turn their military into something stronger, much more so than the Chinese. And it means that the Japanese begin to create their own empire, just like the British had an empire and so forth. Now the Japanese are going to build an empire in Asia. So this is going to be part of that. Right here, this is part of China. Later on, they will also add areas to the north. Well, the Chinese lose this war, just to make the story shorter. They lose the Sino-Japanese War. Japan receives territory. What do they receive? They receive Taiwan. Taiwan is this island right down here off the coast of China. You can see it there. Actually, the Japanese will end up naming it Formosa instead of Taiwan. And of course, it was a pretty good size island, and gave a lot of strategic area for the Japanese Navy. And it's at this point that that the Europeans begin to worry about Japan. Yeah, and we see that. So the Japanese get Taiwan, the Germans get Shandong. That happens when actually a couple of missionaries are killed, and so then the military comes in to put down this thing. So, like I've been saying, merchants, missionaries, military. It often, almost always comes in that order. And other Europeans are taking other territories. So the Germans get the Shandong area, the Japanese are getting Taiwan, the Russians are getting area to the north, the British are getting areas to the south, the French are getting areas in Indochina. And a lot of this territory of China is evaporating. Well, the emperor at this time is named Gongzi, Gongzu, at the advice of one of his main advisors, Kang Youyi. He said, well, we've got to reform things. We've got to make things better. We have to change things. So that's what they begin to do. But again, much too late. It's now, these are called the reforms of 1898. And they decide this time that instead of imitating the Europeans directly, they would imitate the Japanese, because the Japanese obviously are from Asia, and they have found a way to maintain their independence, and using Western, industrialization and Western imperialism, we in China should learn the same. Well, didn't happen. By the way, the Chinese have learned it pretty well these days. They're doing all kinds of things to expand their power, right? They're going out and they're building islands. Do you know that? Have you heard about this? The Chinese are building islands in the south, Southeast Asia. Why are they building? They're just taking dirt and just dumping it and dumping it and dumping it. Dirt, rocks, whatever, and making an island. Why are they making an island? Because they're going to claim it as China. And why? Then you go out 500 miles around that island, they claim all the water and all the rights. And there's oil out there. Yeah. So they're going to get to pump the oil that way. So they are actually creating islands so that they can kind of extend their power out into the ocean, especially where there's oil and other resources they want. Yeah. Well, that's what they're doing. Anybody going to stop them? I don't know. I don't think so. Not right now. I mean, the United States has filed protests and other people that this is not legitimate and so on. But ultimately, what are you going to do about it? Stop buying Chinese stuff? I don't think that's going to happen. Go to war with China? I don't think that's going to happen, at least not anytime soon. So they pretty much get away with it. So they have learned. They have learned. In other words, 100 years later, after they were at their lowest point, in the early 20th century, now you get to the early 21st century, they are extremely powerful. So they've turned it around in 100 years. They really have. Now, they're still growing. They're still got a ways to go. But they are the second largest economy in the world. The United States is the first. And their goal is to surpass us. Well, anyway, let's move on. That's why, by the way, the last chapter of your textbook is called Towards the Pacific Century. I think is what it's called, something like that. Because the 20th century was sometimes called the American century. Right? The 19th century was usually called the European century. And so most people believe that the 21st century is going to be the Pacific century. Things are going to shift. Power is going to shift. It's already shifting to China and India. They're going to be very powerful. And that's probably only going to grow. I don't know. Again, like I said, I'm not a prophet, nor the son of a prophet. But, I've been telling people for over 20 years, you want to get ahead, you want to make sure you're going to do all right, either you or your children, make sure you learn Mandarin Chinese. That's all I'm telling you. Learn Mandarin Chinese. You'll always have a job. You'll always do well. Because you already know English. You learn Chinese. You got all kinds of opportunities opening up for you. All right, not for you, for your children. Buy them those little, put those little headphones on the belly that are putting Chinese in there, talking in Chinese. Have them take Chinese lessons when they're babies. They'll learn the English from you, but they need to learn the Chinese. That's all I'm saying. Because, look at it this way. If it's moving over there, it's going to be India or China, or maybe both. They already speak English in India, sort of. So you can communicate with them. But you can't communicate with the Chinese. And you don't know what they're doing to you or what they're saying. Right? So, I'm just saying. A word to the wise. I've been saying it since the 1990s. Maybe even the 1980s, but certainly in the 1990s. I've been saying it now for 30 years. Learn Chinese. Is anybody listening to me? No, they're really not. But someday, you'll probably say, you know what? Maybe I should have learned Chinese. I won't be around to say I told you so, but, maybe you'll remember me, perhaps fondly. That weird guy that taught history said I should learn Chinese. I didn't listen to him. Well, anyway, the Japanese had modified the Western ideas, and so we see that the Chinese will now have 100 days reform. But of course, many people are resistant to this because, China had been so isolated for so long. The Chinese way is the best way. It's the right way. Why would we want to do some other way, especially some Western way or some Japanese way? We are Chinese. We are the best. We should do it our way. Kind of like that old slogan. What was that old slogan? Have it your way. You never heard that slogan, right? It was Burger King. What was that, Burger King? Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, special orders don't upset us. Serve it your way. Or is that McDonald's? Well, one of those. Come in, you just tell them what you want because they're going to make it while you're waiting. They probably don't say that anymore because nobody's doing that anymore. Nobody is making it while you wait. It's all made ahead of time. Well, anyway. Much resistance, and eventually you're going to see that the Empress, pictured here, she's a powerful woman. She ends up taking over China from her husband and running things. She's going to try to, you should look her up. She's an interesting lady. Empress CZ. Well, here's another thing that happens about this time, 1899. I put this up here, this is my illustration. I was trying to find something to illustrate. How do I illustrate an open door policy, open door notes? Well, I put up an open door. There we go. Open door out in the middle of nowhere. But the idea here is that the United States is not a big player in this, although the United States now has interests in the area because we've gotten ourselves involved with the Philippines, which isn't too far away. And that's getting us involved with, we're worried about the Japanese, even back here. And of course, I guess those worries proved to be legitimate 42 years later, they will prove to be a concern, right? So John Hayes, U.S. Secretary of State, goes to the Europeans and he says, basically, he says to them, look, if you make China too weak, it's going to fall apart. And if China falls apart, I'm paraphrasing, if China falls apart, guess who's going to really benefit from this? Japan is going to benefit from this greatly. You Europeans. Europeans are already making enough money. Give them a break. Limit your influence. Don't interfere. What they were doing is that since basically the Europeans controlled all the ports, the Chinese couldn't even really ship goods in and out without paying the Europeans. Can you imagine that? That you want to ship something out of China, you got to pay Britain to use their harbor in China. That's the kind of situation that we had here. Plus, you got the British collecting tariffs on any goods coming in, or the other Europeans. They said, look, let the Chinese collect something, right? Let the Chinese have some money. It's kind of like, I remember when I was a kid, I had a nephew. Every time he came to see me, he wanted to play Monopoly, right? The problem was he wasn't really very good at Monopoly. And Monopoly takes a long time, especially with just two people. And so, to sort of appease him, I would play Monopoly. But it would get to the point where I had to have a goal. And my goal was to own everything on the board. And so what I would do is I would make deals with him. I'd say, well, okay, you don't have to pay me that. Just give me that piece of property. So he'd give me this piece of property. Then he'd land on another thing. I said, well, you don't have any money. Just give me this other thing. Pretty soon I owned every piece of property. And I was making loans to him so he could keep playing the game. So I could win every piece of property on the board. That was my only challenge, is could I keep this house of cards going until I owned everything. And, I did it. I did it on some occasions. Eventually, sometimes he would give up. He didn't want to play anymore. I said, come on, let's just play a little bit more. So. Well, this is sort of what's happening here in China. The Europeans have taken over so much that if they don't prop up the Chinese some, it's all going to collapse. The Chinese are just going to have to cash it in, give it up. And then it's a free-for-all. Now the Europeans maybe have to fight each other. The Japanese are going to get involved. So this is basically what the United States is saying. Give the Chinese some access to making money. If you don't let them make any money, how are they going to pay you? How are they going to survive? And basically the argument is we're better off having a weak China than a strong Japan. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? They were charging the Chinese for a harbor and to use the railroad, because most of the railroads were actually built by the Europeans, even though they went into China. And so they would give the British had this railway, the British would get a very low rate to use it, but if the Chinese wanted to use it, they charge them a high rate to use it. Well, it helped a little, but it was never a full treaty. It was kind of just an agreement. Sometimes they used to call those a gentleman's agreement. Let's just agree this is what we're going to do. But it was nothing binding. Well, it's obvious in China things are in bad shape. This will lead to the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. This is where, heavyweight boxers lined up and they said, we're not going to fight anymore. No, I'm joking. The Boxer Rebellion's got nothing to do with boxing in that sense. It gets the nickname the Boxer Rebellion because the people who were rebelling in it were sometimes called boxers by the Europeans because they would do certain kinds of exercises outside. Sort of like, they go outside and sort of punch the air. I'm talking about that. That's sort of this kind of stuff. You guys probably do it in your dorm room. You don't want anybody to see you doing your stuff. And that's the kind of stuff they were doing. And so they said, oh, those guys are sort of like boxers. They're out there sort of exercising, kind of punching at the air and that kind of. Well, they were actually also organizing themselves and became a secret. There was a secret group, especially in the northern part of China, in rural areas. They were very upset by, of course, all the troubles in China and how the economy was, how much trouble they were in. And add to that, there were also droughts, which had hurt the crops, right? And there was a lot of unemployment. So this will lead to what is called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion. I was going to say instead of that, I was going to say that it was these dogs, these special kind of dogs that were called boxers. No? Hey, by the way, have you heard, somebody asked, what kind of doctor is Dr. Pepper? They said he's a physiologist. No? No? No, you don't like it? The last class kind of liked that one. I guess no takers here. Well, that's bad enough. I don't have to worry that I stole it because no one else would want to claim it. That's good. I don't have any writers, so. A physiologist. You'll laugh later. You'll process it. Later on, 2-3 hours from now, you go, oh, and that'll be it. Okay. And you probably, here's what I guarantee you, somebody in here is going to tell somebody else that joke. They're going to tell it. If you do, just promise me on Thursday, you tell me, you confess. Confession's good for the soul. That you actually did tell your roommate or somebody that.
You get extra credit.
No, you don't get extra credit. Not everything's about extra credit. Well, anyway, Boxer Rebellion. What happens with the Boxer Rebellions? Well, foreign residents are attacked, right? It's pretty easy to find them because they all live in the same neighborhood. The British all kind of live in this little area where all the British live, and the French all live where the French live, and so forth. You understand that. I mean, it still happens today. There are enclaves of people, and it kind of makes sense, right? If you're living in a different land, right, where maybe you don't speak the language that well, and you like certain foods they don't have, that you live in this area together, and then some guy starts a little bakery that bakes the stuff like back home, or has the food, has a little restaurant. It's got your food from back home, that kind of thing, right? So that explains it, I think. I mean, we see that here in Florida, right? You can go over to, what's the place? Ybor City, right? If you want to get Cuban stuff, that's the place to go, right? A lot of Cuban people, Cuban ancestry live there. And so it's easy for these guys who want to attack Europeans to find them. Because basically they live in the same neighborhoods in the city. And so they go after them. So they attack the foreign areas, the foreign neighborhoods of Beijing especially. So when that happens, of course, now the British, the French, or whoever these Europeans people are fearful. They're being targeted. And so guess what? The Europeans send troops in to protect their citizens and to put down the rebellion because they know they're not going to be safe until they do. During this fighting, either by accident or on purpose, troops destroyed temples. That did not sit too well with the local people, right? And I can imagine maybe some of the British troops, French troops, whatever, said, let's take out this little shrine for these people. They cause us all this trouble. They're attacking us, so let's attack something of theirs. Or it could have happened accidentally, but at any rate, this doesn't do anything to help the situation. And after this is done and the foreign governments put down the rebellion, guess what? This is what we used to call insult to injury. They made the Chinese pay them. So we're doing your job. You should have kept this rebellion under control. Since you didn't keep the rebellion under control, here's your bill. We had to send our troops in to clean up your mess. Well, there you have it. So finally, we're going to see the end of an empire coming. Here are pictures of the last emperor of China. By the way, there is a movie called The Last Emperor. Anybody ever seen that one? It's an old movie now. I don't know, what was it out? Maybe in the 90s, maybe? Was it Spielberg? I think it was Steven Spielberg made The Last Emperor, wasn't it? 85, 90, somewhere in there. Well, anyway, it's worth watching. if you're interested in this period, I think it would, be of interest to you. And it's about this guy right here. I mean, at least it begins with him. Henry Puyi. The old dynasty is attacks, and there are reforms, and so they're struggling. Remember, they tried this in 1895. Now it's 1905, and they institute a new Western-style civil service exam. This, we probably don't get the full impact of that, but you remember I think we mentioned in here earlier, that the civil service exam in China had been tied to the teachings of Confucius. This has been a traditional thing for hundreds of years in China. And to change that exam to a Western-style exam was seen by many as just losing all identity as Chinese. They also began to change the Constitution, or explore changing the Constitution. That was in 1905. And then in 1908, the Empress and the former Emperor Guji, they both die in 1908. That's what then leaves this guy, Henry Puyi, as the emperor, and he will get the I suppose, a title that you wouldn't really want, the last emperor of China. He's young, he's a teenager, I don't know how old, he's like 15 or something when he comes to power, 16. And of course, he's in charge now of a China that is just, it's all kinds of problems, economic problems, military problems, it's every kind of problem you can imagine. So the deck is stacked against him from the beginning, and plus, he's very young and inexperienced on top of that. So at this time then, there is a movement to change things in China. They call it the Revive China Society movement. They call for basically democracy in China. Get rid of the emperor, get rid of the empire, have a democracy. If we're going to go Western, let's go Western, right? Let's have a Western-style government. And so here is this guy. Here's two pictures of him. Sun Yat-sen. He is a medical doctor. He was actually trained in Hawaii. He's from China, got training, medical training in Hawaii, comes back to China, sees all the mess that's there. He decides to try to initiate some changes. And so in 1910, there are elections for a national assembly. That would be a whole different kind of government. But they do initiate some reforms. However, their reforms are not really happening quick enough, and they're not there's a lot of peasants out there in the countryside that are sort of left out of these changes. Because most of these people bringing the changes are from the city. They're kind of intellectuals, they're from the city. And there's a lot of people out in the countryside who feel like, well, they don't care anything about us. They don't understand us. Kind of like, I believe there's a guy running for president who I think yesterday basically said being a farmer, there's nothing to it. You just make a hole, put some seeds in it, and everything grows. It hasn't gone over well. Yeah. But, he's going to get it done, he said, I believe. Michael get it done. He's the one who said it. And he's really made a lot of farmers upset. He sort of implied farmers are kind of dumb, slow, nothing to their job. Just, they just go out there, sort of turn the soil over, throw the seeds in, and you're done. So anyway, that's sort of the way that the people out in the countryside felt about this. This doesn't really address our problems. But nonetheless, the people in the city formed this Revived China Society, and they, Sun Yat-sen, who's pictured here, 1866 to 1925, he will eventually be elected president of China. So there's a Chinese Republic that starts in 1912. They wanted a strong government. They wanted democracy. They wanted nationalism. And so the followers, Sun and his followers, revolt in 1911 against the last emperor, who is, doesn't have much going for him. And they easily take over, and Sun Yat-sen is put in as the first president of China. Now, eventually he'll be forced to resign, because while he does have sort of the ideas about these things, he does not control the military. And this guy ends up taking over. His name is General Yuan Shikai. He'll become, I guess you might say, the leader of China. I don't know if you want to call him president, but he will rule it from a military standpoint now. So it's almost like a military dictatorship or whatever. He's a very powerful general. But still, China economically, China all the way around is in big, big trouble. There's no way around it. And China collapses finally under its own weight. The republic won't hold. The empire is gone. By the way, the last emperor flees to Japan, where the Japanese take him in and say, oh yes, we have now the last emperor of China. This gives them credibility to now come back into China and take more territory. And say, well, they're really doing it for the emperor, that kind of thing. And so the corruption, the imperialism, what we've taken a look at here quickly is this just downward collapse of China in about a little over 100 years throughout the 19th century. This paves the way then for a very tumultuous period in Chinese history, say from 1912 until 1949, right? 37 years of troubles. And in that 37 years, there's going to be 2 world wars in which China will be kind of involved in both of them in a peripheral way, mostly, but they're also affected by it. And we'll have to talk more about that later. But China will eventually be boosted up, because it's thought, the United States thinks, for example, they're going to need China's help to take Japan at the end of World War II. And because they're going to have to make an invasion, amphibious assault, and they wanted to do part of that from China. Once the A-bomb, the atomic bomb, is created, the necessity for that invasion is now seen as not being there. And so our commitment to China wanes with that, and that's how we see ultimately the rise of communist China. But that's a discussion, I guess, for another day. All right, we'll end it there for today.